Hello everyone, I'm Jon Evans, and welcome to another episode of One-on-One. Nina de Gramont has had a 2-decade career as an author, along with being a mom, a wife, and a professor at UNCW, where she teaches creative writing and other courses. Nina had her first book published back in 2001, and 8 have followed since then. Number 9, though, has taken her career to new heights. This is the book. It's called The Christie Affair. It published back in February and became a New York Times bestseller. It's Nina's fictional story about what happened to author Agatha Christie during her famous 11-day disappearance. The Christie Affair became the February selection for Academy Award-winning actress Reese Witherspoon's book club. And Nina told me during our interview she had to keep that secret from everyone for months. New York Times best-selling author, educator, mom, and wife, Nina de Gramont, welcome to the One-on-One with Jon Evans podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Jon.
It is so good to talk to you, and I rattled off all those titles you have. Which one is the toughest right now in this part of your life?
I've been thinking about this, and I have to say right now, as COVID hopefully is gasping its last gasps, that teacher has been the most challenging part. I love it and I enjoy it and it's incredibly rewarding, but I'm looking forward to the day when Zoom and masks and everything is a memory.
Well, I want to talk about The Christie Affair, your best-selling book, but since you brought up teaching, as an educator, as a successful writer, what is your enlightenment when you're working with students? What gives you the most excitement? What puts a smile on your face when you're dealing with students who want to be the next Nina, who want to be the next Brad Thor or Jack Carr or something like that?
There's so much, Jon, on so many different levels. I think that I teach creative writing. It's always really exciting when a current or former student publishes something, whether it's in a journal or a book. It's always exciting when I see their work improving. It's always exciting when they introduce me to an author I hadn't known. And I have to say, too, that, the upside of COVID has been the camaraderie between the students and the way they lift each other up and how kind they are to each other and supportive of each other is very inspiring.
How did the students react to A Christie Affair? Is it something you talk to them about in class? Is it something they ask you questions about? What does an 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old talk about with their educator who was on the New York Times bestseller list writing about somebody who lived nearly a century ago?
Mostly they just say congratulations, and they're really happy for me and very supportive of me. I had to miss class a bunch of times, especially in February, and they were great cheerleaders.
It's interesting, in my instance here in the newsroom, when we have an intern or when we have a young employee who finally, after asking for assistance, gets it and that light bulb comes on and they can accomplish that task on their own. That's the joy that somebody like me gets. Is it the same with you when you see that light bulb go on and that student in the third row, second seat over, all of a sudden gets what they may not have gotten before?
Yes, absolutely. And more often than not, I see it on the page instead of in the classroom. But I'll see it discussing, when they're discussing each other's work. It's very gratifying.
When somebody says New York Times best-selling author, what's your immediate reaction? Is it pride? Is it modesty? Is it, uh-oh, I've got to follow this one up with something even better next time? What runs through Nina's mind as that phrase is uttered to introduce you like I did a few minutes ago?
It's all of the above. I'm definitely proud. It's something I worked toward for a long time and hoped would happen for many years. I will say, I think this is my ninth book. My first book was published in 2001. And if that book had hit the New York Times bestseller list, I would think it was because I was so brilliant and preordained and it was my destiny. But having been through all the ups and downs and seeing, knowing so many other authors, I know that there's a hefty dose of luck involved. So that's where the modesty comes in. And yes, I am a little nervous about following this up.
It took a while between the distance from me to you and the Christie Affair, I guess 7 years before they published. Was it the length of time you had to go about researching Agatha Christie, or were other things in play, COVID among them, that is responsible for that 7 year time period?
So the book was acquired by a publisher in the end of February 2020. So the sort of 2 years between that and publication, I think, was a little bit due to COVID. Um, Before that, it was just the daunting task of researching and all the reading I had to do. I will say, too, that at one point, I had written a draft or two of the book, and I just had a panic of, I'm an American. I cannot write this book. And I put it aside and wrote an entirely different book. And then I put that one aside and came back to the Christie Affair. So there
What
was
was the
a
toughest
little stretch where I backed off from it.
What was the toughest part of doing the research, Nina? I mean, going through this, it's you see the references to Titanic, you see the references to the books of the day. But the thing that I noticed was the jargon. I felt like I was watching Downton Abbey, or I felt like I was reading something of that period.
Right.
And I imagine writing in 2015, 16, whenever you were writing it, and trying to write in that time period may have been quite the challenge.
It was. I will say Downton Abbey was very helpful to me, not only in terms of the jargon, but I don't know if it's actually shot in Yorkshire, but it's meant to take place in Yorkshire. And a plan I always had was once the book was sold to travel to England, but because of COVID, I couldn't do that. So I watched a lot of English television. I read a lot of English books from the time. Agatha Christie's books were incredibly helpful as far as getting the language right. I think the hardest thing was the mistakes that I made and had to figure out ways to correct, which happened with every draft. And then, you start researching a particular place and time, and it keeps giving you sort of more bits of history that you hadn't thought of. There's a portion of the book takes place in Ireland during the teens, the 19 teens. And the first couple times I wrote it, I completely omitted the Irish State Rebellion. And then all of a sudden, I came across a word about that, and I thought, oh my gosh, I have an English girl in Ireland
Right.
in 1919. I have to talk about that.
At any point in time during this whole process, did you ever sit back and say, I really think I'm onto something here? Did that ever click? Or is this is an idea I have, I'm going to try and write this? Because, and again, I don't want to personalize this too much, but when I'm writing a story or when I'm writing something, every once in a while, I'll come up with a line, I'm like, wow, that's pretty good. I'm going to go on that way. What about you? Did that click in your mind during this process?
Yes, I mean, I think that when you're working on something creative, you always have to sort of respond that way to your own work in progress in order to keep the excitement going.
Mm-hmm.
So I definitely felt that way. And, I was working with sort of different storylines, and there were times when I figured out ways to make them come together that felt like eureka moments to me. But again, I think because I've been down this road before, I didn't think, certainly before it was acquired by a publisher, I didn't think, oh, this is going to take the world by storm. Or if I did think it, I immediately thought, don't be silly, just get back to work. who knows
Right.
what's going to
Yeah,
happen.
and you can't let yourself think sometimes like that, because then you'll drift off and not continue the true path that you set yourself on.
Yeah, exactly.
Did,
Exactly. And I think the real pleasure is always going to be kind of between you and the page. I mean, selling a book is fun, having it be successful is fun, whatever your definition of successful is. But I think one of the benefits of being sort of a seasoned writer or any kind of artist is that you know that the best part is always going to be the work itself.
and the pride you feel in the work yourself, and then the response you get from the readership. Did you follow the same process in writing this that you have your others? And I ask that in this way. I keep bringing up these two gentlemen because they are two of my favorite writers. Brad Thor sits down and just it spills out on the keyboard. Jack Carr says he has an outline for his. Wiley Cash wrote his last book longhand. What about you? Did you follow the same process in this one as you did others? And what is your writing process?
It really varies book to book. I have written outlines. I do sometimes write outlines. With this book, I didn't really write an outline of what was going to happen, but Agatha Christie was missing for 11 days. So I did have that calendar. I had above my desk, a page for every day that she was missing, and I had written on it the factual things that occurred in terms of the search on those days. I did, the one time I had written a historical novel, it did not, I ended up not finishing it. It was a novel I started writing about Emily Dickinson. And what I did when I set out to write that book was an enormous amount of research. I visited Amherst. I really spent a year reading and scouring and collecting. And then when I sat down to write it, I didn't have anything unique to say because I'd spent that time sort of learning what other people had written about her factually. So this time I really made a concerted effort to do minimal research until I got the story I wanted to tell down. And then I put the book aside and delved very heavily into researching.
And you told me prior that you didn't read Agatha Christie's books going into this, because do you think that would have played some kind of a role in the way you shaped the novel?
No, honestly, once I did, so I wrote a draft and then I read her novels, and the novels informed the rewrite so much that maybe if I'd read them first, I would have done some of the things I did later in the initial draft. So maybe it would have been a little time saver. I don't know. I certainly, one question I've been asked a lot is what part of writing the book was the most fun? And the answer is very easily reading the Agatha Christie novels. That was really a delight.
I don't want to give away too much of the plot to folks who haven't read The Christie Affair. But one thing that I really noticed going through this are the Agatha's husband and his mistress. To me, they went from really being committed to this affair. As it went along, they both started having questions and questioning their commitment to the affair, to each other. And I found that fascinating. As the chapter went by, you started seeing more questions pop up in their minds. They all of a sudden were feeling sorry for somebody who they were running around on 3 weeks ago. Is that what you tried to convey? Is that what you get from a lot of people, or was that just Jon Evans's response?
That's actually the first I've heard that, but I think it's a very astute observation. And certainly that's what happened to them emotionally. Certainly it's what happened to Archie Christie emotionally in the novel. Once he started worrying about her well-being and thinking about her being gone forever, he felt more responsible for her and attached to her. And I think I was just thinking about sort of the imperative of the moment. I think people in general are pretty task focused. I do think Archie Christie too in reality was a pretty task focused person. So I think once he in reality was wanting to leave his wife and marry his mistress, he was laser focused on that. So I'm trying to imagine if during Agatha Christie's disappearance he had sort of shifted his task focus to finding her, what
Mhm.
that would do to him emotionally. And honestly, I just, for the novel, I think it was much more interesting to um, make him be torn during that period of time and less resolute and less ruthless.
I've listened to a lot of interviews that you've done and read a lot of interviews that you've done, and I don't think anybody has asked you this question. Maybe they have, maybe they haven't. Do you remember the day and the feeling when you did your last piece of work on this, when you wrote the last word, whether it was a rewrite, whether it was an edit, when you put this thing to bed, what was your emotion after you typed end or period or send or whatever it was? Was it a great big exalting breath? Was it, I hope the world likes it? What was the emotion?
That is an interesting question. It's a hard one to answer because the process of writing a book is there are so many moments where you think you've written the final word. With this book, I wrote a draft to send to my agent. He read it and said, "It's great. I want you to make this and this and this and that change." So then I sent that draft to him, and then he submitted it to publishers. The publisher, my editor, Jennifer Enderlin, who's a genius, acquired it. She's not a genius for acquiring it. She's a genius for the suggestions and the changes she makes. I had to rewrite it for her a couple times. And then you go through copy edits and proofreading. And because the book came out simultaneously in England, I was doing it at the same time for a different draft for another publisher. So honestly, if I really think of the last time that I worked on the book and then submitted it, I think I was like, phew, don't have to look at this thing again for a while, if ever.
That's funny. I can imagine it probably started, oh, another edit? Oh, another edit?
Exactly.
That
There was
that is
one point where I was doing, it was actually super helpful because the copy edits came in for the American version at the same time I was doing the page proofs for the English version. So I could kind of, proofreaders and copy editors, they all kind of caught different things. So I could compare the two drafts, but it was labor intensive. I was excited to put it aside for a while once I was done with it.
Take me inside the world of putting this on the shelf. How much feedback do you have on the jacket? How much feedback do you have on all of this, Nina? Are there just your words inside? Do you have yes or no on the outside? Take me back to how much of Nina is in the cover, the picture, the font, everything like that.
In all honesty, none. I mean, Jennifer and probably the marketing team a little bit wrote the copy that's on the inside, on the jacket. And as far as the cover, they sent it to me, and I remember I was at my parents' house, and I opened it on my iPad, and I just thought, oh my gosh, this looks like it should be in like a Tiffany jewelry box. I mean, I had no complaints. I was completely dazzled. Now, if I'd hated it and come back to them with, I don't like that, I'm sure they would have worked with me. But in this instance, Michael Storings is the designer for that cover, and I think he just did an extraordinary job.
And you've been writing now for the better part of 2 decades and publishing. But is there more pressure on Nina now? And what are you trying to do to be the same Nina as a writer that you were before all of the reviews and the great things being said about the Christie Affair?
What I'm trying to do is block all that out and focus on what I want to write. I definitely have moments of how can I do the same thing? But then I think if I really make a concerted effort to do the same thing, it will end up being disastrous. So I think I have to kind of return to what I said earlier and just get private with myself and the page and not think about the readers just yet or the.
Where were you when you got the call that Reese's book club had selected the Christie Affair? Do you remember that day?
I was right here. It was
right in your
I
office?
think I was standing at it was about 5 minutes before I was going to teach. And my editor, Jennifer, called and said, I have the most thrilling news. Reese Witherspoon has chosen the Christie Affair for her February book pick. And I screamed and I jumped up and down. And Jennifer said, but you can't tell anybody. And I said, well, everybody I know just heard me scream. I don't know what I'm going to tell them. And it was amazing. And then I had to say, I've got to go teach. So it was definitely the most distracted class I've ever taught. But it was very thrilling and very exciting.
How and when did you become interested in writing?
The how is, I think, so I think every writer is originally a reader. So from an incredibly young age, reading was my solace and my entertainment and my secret thing that I did when I was supposed to be sleeping. And from there, I think, reading a lot tends to turn people into good writers. So it was something I was praised for as a kid. And I had teachers starting to say, this is really good, you should be a writer. And I think all of us tend to follow what we get approbation for. So I wanted to be a writer early on. I had a brief, in college, I started out as a performing arts major, but then I realized I had just crippling stage fright. So I switched to an English major. And really by, I would say, my junior year in college, I knew I wanted to be a writer.
And you got a master's in fine arts degree in creative writing at UNCW. You went to Colorado first and then came to UNCW. How did you land here? Was it the program? Was it a dart on a map, which I've heard people moving to Wilmington for that reason? Or was it to get the master's MFA?
My favorite story about arbitrarily moving to Wilmington is we had a professor from up north who drove from Canada, and they decided that as soon as they hit a bridge that said slippery when wet as opposed to freezes when wet, they decided this is where I'm going. So for me, I had started my master's at Colorado, and I didn't finish it. I got married and we moved to Massachusetts. And then my husband, who had finished his degree and published a book, was offered a job as a professor at UNCW. So we moved here. I just had a baby and I was like, oh, I'm going to need something to do. I think I was pregnant at the time when I was applying. So I imagined myself just idly sitting around very bored. So I was like, oh, as long as I'm there, I'll finish my degree.
And your first book was a collection of short stories, correct?
Yes.
Which was put together in the book form. What was it like for you, young child, working and trying to launch a writing career?
It was challenging, and it was certainly a very, very busy time, and a time where there were no windows for sort of doing crosswords or watching TV or anything like that. As far as the transition from short stories to novel, I was very daunted by the idea. I really didn't want to write a novel. I wanted to stick with short stories.
Really?
And then I took a class with the great Clyde Edgerton here at UNCW, and he showed us how he outlines books on storyboards, like in his journal, and it was just sort of like a grid of 10 pictures. And I thought, if I map something out like that and just do the 10-piece grid and write 10 things that I want to happen, I think that that's a way I can sort of hold a long form story in my head, and that made it seem doable. So thanks to Clyde, I had that breakthrough.
Well, let me thank Clyde publicly now, because if it wasn't for him, the world would not have the great Nina de Gramont books. So thank you to Clyde, because we wouldn't be as enriched with some of your great work since then. You published 2 works under pseudonyms. Why?
So both of those books I was hired to write. I did a book for Marvel Comics and Hyperion, which is a novel. It was an origin story of the X-Men character Rogue.
Right.
And I was sort of deciding whether I would take that job. As an influence, I looked to a great young adult author named Judy Blundell, who won a National Book Award for one of the novels she writes under her own name, but then she writes for it's the Star Wars series under a pseudonym. So I thought, oh, I'll be like Judy Blundell and I'll take this job and just use a pseudonym. And then the other was, it was a kind of packaged book for Penguin Random House. And they had, at the time, a section of their house where they had people come up with ideas for books and then they'd hire people to write them. So I took that job as well. That's why I wrote the distance from me to you. And I just thought using pseudonyms was a way to differentiate those two works for hire from the books that sort of were born in my own brain.
The book you wrote for Marvel, Rogue Touch, was there a concern that you're battling what the public knew as Rogue from the movie versus what you're doing in the book? And I know, you've got to do what you want to do, but in many instances, perception is reality to a lot of people. And I think that movie had come out before the book, or am I wrong?
Yes, the X-Men movies were very much in the zeitgeist and had come out before I wrote the book. I think honestly the toughest audience for that book were not so much the people who loved the movie, but the people who were really devoted to the comics. But it's funny because in a way it was really good preparation for creating a fictional character out of Agatha Christie,
Right.
who's also somebody people have, really strong attachments to, not only emotionally, but their idea of who she is and what she would do. So in an unexpected way, it prepared me psychologically for taking on this other task.
Was the feedback positive from that group of a legion of fans?
From Rogue?
The Rogue book.
Uh, Not especially, honestly.
Really?
I think the book was more popular with people who weren't particularly attached to that character.
Right.
They're a hard audience. These Marvel people are very serious.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. They are. How about Agatha Christie fans? What have they reached out to you? Have you heard from many of them in response to this?
Not directly, but I've seen a lot of bloggers, including, British bloggers and devotees of her work have been very kind and supportive, and I've been very relieved and thankful of their response.
Do you read a lot of reviews and blogs?
Yes, I do. I shouldn't, but I do. It's really fascinating to me and terrifying to me, and I think I always feel like if I face that fear, it will go away. Everyone tells me not to, but I do.
Yeah, in my career, emails that would have bothered me 20 years ago don't bother me as much. There are some things, if people question my objectivity, if they question my fairness, that gets under my skin. But why you didn't cover this versus why you didn't cover that, you're no good, I'm never going to watch you anymore, those things kind of roll off a lot easier now than they would have, say, 20 or 25 years ago. The same with you?
Yeah, and I mean, I think that, you sort of learn to, I think when my first book came out, I was so terrified of ever getting a bad review. And now, when my first book came out, there wasn't, you weren't hearing, it was 2001, the internet had not sort of evolved into the great comment section it is now. So it was
Right.
mostly just like print and professional reviews. And then you do sort of become inured to it. And you sort of, personally, I know there are a lot of people say you can't believe the good reviews because then you have to believe the bad reviews. But I am completely comfortable believing the good reviews and discarding the bad reviews,
Yeah.
or at least aligning myself with the happy opinions.
And sometimes some criticism actually does you good. I found that it does you good every once in a while.
Yeah, I think that's true. And there's certainly different brands of criticism. There's the
Right.
criticism that seems just completely out of left field that you can dismiss out of hand and disagree with, and then there's the criticism where you think, that's something I'll think about next time I go to work.
And I find those who write with respect are the ones that I welcome more, because let's face it, this is a world now that it doesn't have as much respect for other opinions, other works, other talents as it did even 10 years ago.
Yes, yes. I will say that there is a faction of people who think that they're being respectful, who really are not that respectful.
Right.
So.
You've had two of your works optioned now, if I'm not mistaken, The Last September and now The Christie Affair. Other authors that I've talked to told me about how patient they have to be once you have something optioned, that it's no longer Nina's work once they get optioned. What's that process been like for you?
So it's been different between the two. So the first book that was optioned was actually The Distance from Me to You. And that was one of the books I was hired to write. So I don't own the film rights to that. So I'm not involved at all. I have struck up a friendship online with the screenwriter who kindly got them to give the okay for me to read the script, which was just the greatest fun for me to read what she'd done with it. But with The Christie Affair, it's different because I do own the film rights, and it was my agent, Rich Green, who sold it. So again, I haven't seen the script yet, but I'm in touch with the screenwriter. They'll show it to me. I don't think contractually I have a whole lot of say, but I think as a courtesy, they'll listen to my feedback, and they want my feedback.
Well, that's nice, because when I talked to Kathy Reich, she talked about one of the things that she didn't want Temperance set as a certain age. She wanted to make sure that things were kept, but other things she had to basically say, it's somebody else's now. It's somebody else's product.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's important to remember that the book still stands on its own. The movie, of course, for The Christie Affair, it's going to be a TV series, and I hope it's wonderful. That would be more fun than if it weren't wonderful. But at the same time, it doesn't change, what the book is. And, you think about I just saw that they're making a limited series out of The Time Traveler's Wife, and think about how many books have been made into multiple different versions of movies and series. So I'm trying to separate myself from it a little bit.
Do you and your husband, David, try to outright each other?
No. We're writing in different genres for the most part. And I think that we have such different voices, and we've never been competitive, except sometimes jokingly.
I could just see, your child sitting down at the dinner table with two writers, one English correction here, one English correction here, take the novel this way, take the novel that way. It must be a fascinating conversation around the dinner table.
Yeah, I'll say that our child is very blasé about the books in general. She's grown up with us publishing books, so she thinks it's entirely uninteresting. She does get her grammar corrected quite a bit, much to her benefit, I would say. She speaks beautifully thanks to it. Yes, I think that we do have some interesting conversations. And I will say, I think she really likes telling people that her parents are writers. She finds it an interesting profession.
Did she ever have any?
I'm sure your kids felt the same way.
Did she ever have any desire to want to get into the field?
She is interested in becoming a filmmaker. So she's actually she's going to be a freshman next year at a film school. So we're really excited for her. And I'll say she's interested in writing for film, but in my opinion, she's a great writer of prose too.
You teach students, so you give advice all the time, but to a young writer who may want to delve into the industry, I know you've been asked tons of times, but what do you tell someone who wants to write a book, even if they're a 60-year-old news anchor who's always had that inkling that he's got a book way back in the back of his head? What do you tell somebody who would like to try to delve into that, even for one time?
I say read like a maniac, and make space every day to write, whether you are telling yourself you have to write a certain number of words every day, or you're going to set a timer. I taught once, I think it was for North Carolina Arts Council, I taught a weekend workshop in novel writing. And almost everybody who came to the workshop just had an idea, except for this one woman who was an English professor, and she came in with a stack of about 1,000 pages. And she said she'd accomplished that because every morning she would wake up, sit at her kitchen table, set an egg timer for an hour, and write for that hour. So I think those two things: read a lot, take lots of walks, and try to write every day. And when I tell my students, if you're writing in long form, even if you feel like you have to take a couple days off a week, you have to visit the manuscript every day, even if it's just to look at a page or change a character's name. You have to check in with it every single day.
When might we see a film of the Christie Affair or a production of the Christie Affair?
I don't know. Like I said, I'm waiting on the script, and hopefully once that's done, they'll get some actors attached and I'll have more news. But right now, I'm just eagerly awaiting that first script draft.
Well, we can enjoy the original, The Christie Affair, New York Times best-selling novel. Nina de Gramont, I've wanted to talk to you for a long time because I know the great work you do at UNCW with students and the next generation of writers. But congratulations for all of your success. I appreciate your time, and thanks for joining us on the One-on-One podcast.
Thank you so much, John. It's been a pleasure.
A big thank you to Nina de Gramont for sparing time from her busy schedule and joining us for this week's podcast interview. If you want more information about Nina or more information about the Christie Affair, you can go to ninadegramont.com. She also has pages at UNCW and on her publisher Simon & Schuster's website, and you can follow Nina on social media. She's active on Facebook, Instagram, and on Twitter too. Now, before we go, I'd like to ask you a favor. Please download and subscribe to the One-on-One with Jon Evans podcast on whatever app you use to listen to your favorite shows. And if you'd be so kind, please leave us a rating or a review. I really do want to know what you think about the interviews we do, and the more feedback we have from friends like you, the higher we'll be listed on the podcast apps, and the better chance we'll have of bringing in more new listeners. I'm Jon Evans. Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of One-on-One.